Good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you to what should be our fifth annual Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Research Symposium for the College of Information and Communications, but we did have that year, the pandemic year, but we are absolutely excited to bring it back in person, and I am pleased to welcome you on behalf of the dean, who could not be with us this morning, and the college, and to share with you all of the wonderful events that we will have today. I'm happy to introduce Dr. Karen Gavigan, who is the professor and interim director of the school. But before I do that, I want to acknowledge the tremendous help that we've received to bring this program to you today. First of all, the DEI Original Research Symposium Committee, which happened to be Doctors Copeland and Kobua, who helped me to plan and present the very first symposium. And our very first keynote speaker is now our very own Augusta Baker Chair, Dr. Nicole Cook. So we've come full circle, it seems. Because the inaugural Augusta Baker Chair will be today's keynote speaker. And also I want to acknowledge the contributions of our absolutely amazing communications and administrative team. You see their names listed on the program, so I won't mention all of them, but Michaela Taylor is standing, Louis Ziegler, also present are Danielle McNaughton and Rebecca Friedman, and if I miss anyone, Gina Holmes, all of you, thank you so very much. And now Dr. Gavigan.
Thank you, Shirley, and I'll see it's this one I think we're using. Welcome, everybody. I'm Karen Gavigan, and Interim Director of the School of Information Science, and I was so honored when Shirley asked for us to be acknowledged, the iSchool, because we are celebrating 50 years of the School of Information Science, and I hope to see a lot of you tonight when we celebrate in this room our deans and directors lecture as well. So this is such an important event, showcasing research in the college in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I want to thank Shirley because she was just out front with the concept of this. I invited some of my friends in the College of Education, and when they saw the speakers and everything, they were just so impressed. And Shirley had the foresight to plan this over 5 years ago. So thank you, Shirley, for that. Appreciate it. So Shirley has thanked a lot of you in the room. Also want to give a shout out to Karen Morawski. She has been working with us very closely. She's here with Thomas Cougar to allow us to have this beautiful space and done some work with that. We have got a really talented pool of speakers, very excited, and I love the diversity of their topics. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Dr. Kim Thompson from the iSchool, and she will moderate our panel session. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's good to see you here today, and it's good to see a lot of your mouths as well. This is an exciting day for me. Welcome to this amazing panel that we have today. We have 4 speakers. We have Jason Broughton, who is the Director of the National Library Service for the Blind and Print Disabled. We have Dr. Andrea Hickerson, who is the the J School, the School of Journalism and Mass Communication Director and Associate Dean of the College of Information and Communications. We have Jenna Spiering, who is an assistant professor in the iSchool, and we have Cearra Harris, who is a presidential fellow and a doctoral student in our program. So each of them will speak in turn, and then at the end, we'll have a few minutes for questions. So I'm going to start by introducing Jason Broughton. Jason is a U of SC MLIS alum and the director of the National Library Service for the Blind and Print Disabled. And Jason will discuss diversity, equity, and inclusion in library information science issues from the perspective of the National Library Service as the director. And he will focus on 3 or 4 challenge topics, but also mention some bright spots related to what is in development. And so I'll turn the time over to Jason.
Thank you. All right, can you hear me? Good. I already have a booming voice, and for those who know me, I love to talk, and this is a dangerous thing to have me in front of. Well, good afternoon, well, good morning. My name is Jason Broughton, Director of the National Library Service in the Library of Congress. And within that, one of the things that I have been able to experience upon my trajectory ending in this position is the wondrous amount of things that I would say was overlooked in going through librarianship in a way that we say we do things that we always necessarily don't fulfill. And in stating that, that would be from the perspective of those who are vision impaired and print disabled. If you're using the word handicap, I will put you on notice now. As a director, we changed our name from handicap, and that is out of sync. It is now disabled is the more appropriate term. And when you're looking at print disabled, that includes a much larger spectrum. So we're talking about intellectual capabilities, we're looking at reading disabilities, and a whole host of things that also never really kind of get looked at when you're kind of examining it through the lens of librarianship with DEI. One of the things that we would really be, I would say, focusing on as major issues is one, we are in national service. And so we are in every state and in U.S. territory, and we also are overseas in a variety of ways. Our mission is very simple, and this is one of our biggest challenges, that all may read. What a massive challenge that is. That means for those of us who operate standardly through life and have information thrown at us, you probably are worried about your emails on your phone, you are worried about a whole variety of things. If you are a doctoral student, if you're a professor, the massive reams of things that you have to read and volumes to go through. There's another subset that just cannot get enough because it's not in the proper format for them to actually obtain it. And even in that case, it's limited. So we're navigating technological changes with format design because you have a whole spectrum of people that need it in a variety of ways, followed by geography. South Carolina still sees itself as a rural area. Last time I checked, because I was also head of the census in Vermont, South Carolina still calls itself a rural state. I have to laugh. But within that, it does have rural pockets. And in looking at that with a technological challenge, you then have to worry about what do people then do if you could provide them a format, even if it's hardware, something self-contained that can be shipped to them like we do in the mail. What happens if those people also have problems and you're looking at people in urban areas having wonderful connectivity in most cases, and those people in rural areas don't? We are moving toward a virtual-based platform, and that is a major concern for those people across the country who do not have good connectivity. You will be left out. The Postal Service is nice. We utilize it since our inception, and it's a wonderful partnership, but it too is going through some interesting challenges. Another thing that we have to worry about when we talk about DEI from our perspective is when you hear the word National Library Service, usually what I get is the following: oh, you do such wonderful work. My grandmother used your service. And we love that. But do you see, if you flip it, what is not at the table? No talk of youth, children, just left out of the market. And they are there. So we have the challenge of being seen one way, but not providing full spectrum services, because we call the National Library Service to all and as many people as possible. So we're going to try to ramp up with that. Other aspects would be, again, going back to technology, everybody wants to keep up. So one of the unique things that I would say is technological demands and obsolescence, which goes into a whole nother area of equity that we don't talk about, which is, what do you do with digital literacy? You have a younger generation born in technology. As I look across this room, a lot of us are no longer spring chickens. I was born when this college actually celebrates its 50 years, and I think I look good for being 50. And the college does as well. But in doing that, you can see that there are going to be some discrepancies of like who is more applicable to technology, and those changes very rapidly, as opposed to who's here now and having to pick up and learn. And in a large case, particularly in the South, because the South, starting from, guess where, Maryland down to Florida, even though Florida doesn't consider itself Southern, or Texas, that big swing. The South has the most disabilities across the entire country, this whole section. And within that, there are people who unfortunately come to having a disability later in age. So if you lost your eyesight and you used to have it, and I'm now having to tell you to think about Braille, use a talking book machine, and you don't have some digital literacy skills, imagine the challenge of that. How do you navigate it? Because you're coming to it later. That is something that we have to look at from one angle, followed by, here you have a director coming in saying, we've got to now worry about keeping up with technological changes and we need to advance that. So just when you might be comfortable in getting used to one version that I've just put out, now I'm coming behind you saying, I actually need you to upgrade. Who's going to teach those digital literacy skills to an aging population? So this is a perspective that's a little bit different. It just shows you where things are at. And I would say in the last item, that's an equity challenge, particularly not just for us, but I think librarianship and the college has done a really good job. I could probably talk about that in a different way a little bit. Would be, I have the wondrous, I would say humbling experience to work with staff that are visually impaired and print disabled. And I really didn't have that experience. I had it in school. I had fellow colleagues that I still keep up with. But when you work with somebody who is in that spectrum, it offers you a very different way of understanding what life is like. And when I say that, we have some people who are wonderful evaluators and testers of services and products. And when I say that, I would not have come at it in the same way they did, because I have sight. These people fully manipulated, broke down, felt, touched, and went back to the vendor and said, here are all your flaws. And I was like, I just would have never thought of it this way. And that opened me up to saying in the world of work, we don't have enough of that in our society. We see people as other or different in a very different way that can be debilitating. And I think if we were to really grasp that, and libraries like to say when I was a public library director, we serve all people, knowing that really isn't exactly the case. We do know why we say that. There is a thing called a library budget that has to get passed. There's a reality. But if you really are truly looking to be very inclusive, you need to rethink what those service populations really look like in your community and how to make those the best fit for you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Next, we'll hear from Cearra Harris. She's an iSchool doctoral student and presidential fellow. Cearra will give us an overview of her current pilot study that aims to take an introspective look into the current landscape of youth disciplinary policies that hinder, in public libraries, disciplinary policies in public libraries, and show how their potentially punitive qualities often mirror many societal inequities that hinder libraries from providing equitable services to youth. Cearra will also briefly discuss her previous experiences as a public librarian addressing equity and inclusion issues in the communities she has served. Cearra.
Hey y'all, how are y'all? Okay, let me pull this up. Perfect. So before I want to get started, I want to send a special thank you to the DEI Research Symposium Committee for extending this invitation to me. As a young researcher, moments where I'm able to really talk about my research with you all is exciting, and it helps me build my confidence and strengthen my skills, so thank you for that. But let's get into it because I'm not here for a long time. So I think I want to start off with us looking back, so doing a quick overview of what I used to do, because that informs what I do right now. We'll highlight some of my programs that I'm the most proud of, programs that I miss as a librarian, and then we'll go into my current research. Y'all, I got through the IRB for the first time, so I want to talk about it. And then we'll conclude this with sharing my final thoughts and a call to action to you all. So looking back, I am a first-year doctoral student in the Library and Information Science program. I received my MLIS from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. I'm also a presidential fellow. I'm the 2021 to 2022 Ethel Bolden Minority Fellow with Richland Library, so I'm excited to see my Richland Library family here. I am also, I just closed out a fellowship with the University of Illinois iSchool, their Young Researchers Fellow. It was the first opportunity that I was able to get my feet wet as a librarian with research, but then I also created an amazing program that I'm extremely excited about that's still in progress now, even though I'm not working with Charlotte anymore. In 2019, I received a great Stories Club grant with the American Library Association that allowed me to take programs like my book club for young women to the next level. I was able to bring that program and just turn it up a notch in a group home in Charlotte, North Carolina. This group home served teen moms who were in DSS custody. So this is the first time I had this program grow every week, and the first time that the young women read each book that I presented to them in its entirety. So that was an amazing experience. And then lastly, I am a 2018 to 2019 Spectrum Scholar, and if y'all know anything about Spectrum Scholar, we wear that like a gold star. We're proud of it. I say all that to say that I fell into librarianship 12 years ago. I've worked in public libraries for 12 years, y'all. That's wild to think. But I love the library, and I always call it my favorite place on earth because I had a public librarian that really poured into me when I was beginning my career. The way that she believed in me made me believe in myself, and I always credit my early success to her. And it's the reason that I became a youth librarian. I wanted to create those same kind of opportunities for the young people that I worked with. I want us to take a moment. It's like a 2-second moment. There have been many moments in my career that have shifted my perspective, and even deeper than that, there have been many moments that have shifted my existence as a Black woman trying to make space for other Black people in the library. The countless and senseless murders of Black people that look like me and my community make it hard sometimes to cope and come into the library and be on the front end and push out programs when I'm not feeling like that on the inside. The murder of Keith Lamont Scott, which is in the white box in the middle, in 2016 took place in Charlotte, North Carolina. At that time, I was working at Imaginon Library, the flagship children's library in Charlotte. The murder of Keith Lamont Scott took place not too far from where I worked at the time. Devastated was an understatement, but I felt it was a call to action. I took a step back in how I facilitated programs, and I radically stopped facilitating programs in-house and only pushed out programs in the community. I felt that was my duty as a Black librarian or a Black library professional, and as a Black woman to go to my community and bring the library programs to them. Because in the time, coming to the library wasn't a priority, but they still needed our services. So from there, I did programs in detention centers, group homeschool, anywhere I could get my hands on kids, I was there. And then after the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd in 2020, I decided we had to take it up a notch. Ooh, no? Okay. So these pictures were taken by a dear colleague and dear friend of mine, Sabrina Robinson. She's a library professional and artist in Charlotte, North Carolina, and she successfully merged her art and activism. The pictures with the signs, I was with Sabrina during those protests in the middle of the pandemic, so we were masked up downtown in Charlotte, protesting in support of our fallen brothers and sisters. These two protests in particular stood out to me because they were led by young people. Young people were leading these protests in partnership with the NAACP. And it was transformative for me because it made me check myself in that moment and thinking, I'm pushing all these programs in the community, but I'm the person leading them, which is a disservice, because if I'm serving young people, they should be the ones leading these programs. They demonstrated that they have the capabilities and the abilities to lead a huge protest throughout the city of Charlotte downtown, so why can't they lead a library program? From there, we got to my baby, y'all, the West Boulevard Library Teen Circular. This, I don't know if y'all are familiar with the popular brand from the 90s, the Black-owned brand FUBU, but their logo was for us, by us, so for Black people, by Black people. I adopted that motto when it came to my library program, and I would always market it and push it out by saying, this is a newspaper for teens, written by teens. I was just there to create space and do all the logistical stuff. My teens pushed out publications every month that focused on the issues that mattered the most to them. We interviewed everyone from community activists, newscasters, Scholastic came, anybody, mental health, anybody I could get my hands on, I brought them into that space with the teens. And not only were they pushing out a quality publication all throughout Charlotte, they were earning virtual volunteer hours in the meantime. So by the time I left, each of my teens had earned over 100 hours of service creating these publications. I also did racial healing circles, which allowed me to take programs like the ones that I did in the middle school that are pictured to the next level, because I was able to create a space where we could, and again, stepping back and just creating the space, allowing for authentic community conversations to happen about the societal issues that mattered most to the young people. And then, more than anything, I saw families come together and have these tough conversations together in these virtual spaces. And as practitioners, you know, creating a program or doing anything in the virtual space comes with a lot of challenges. So to see these programs grow, both of them, the Healing Circles and the Circular, are both still in publication. It was an amazing experience. Me and Sabrina presented about social justice and library programming for the launch conference in Chapel Hill, and it is available to view if you want to know a little bit more about that, because I could talk about social justice in the library all day. But that brings me to my current research, my pilot study. I'm still in the midst of it, but my question is simple to me, and it's, libraries understand that there's a dire necessity to create equitable spaces that are also diverse. To begin dismantling the implicit biases in library services that hinder equity, I pose the question of how libraries can transform their services, policies, and practices to provide equitable access, empower their users, and maintain relevance as valuable community learning centers. And this research is so important to me because I've always focused on library programming. I've always focused on equity within the library. But I think sometimes libraries fall short when we have inequitable policies in place. We're already doing our users a disservice before they even step foot into our location. So if we really want to have an equitable library, we really want the library to be a community center, it starts before our customers even come in. And that's what I want to research. How can we ensure equity when they're at home chilling, not even thinking about us? So I'm looking at two different ways to combat inequities in the library and how we can use transformative library services to really do that work and bring that systemic change. The first is restorative justice. So restorative justice is a fairly new philosophical approach that was initially aimed to replace the punitive disciplinary policies in schools. The main way that restorative justice practices are implemented is through the use of peacemaking circles, which originated in indigenous communities. I love these circles because they focus on accountability and strengthening of relationships instead of just judging a young person from right from wrong. And when we want people, our young people, to become our lifelong library users, establishing those positive relationships is at the forefront of that. When we have harsh disciplinary policies in the library, we create a barrier. Research has shown that proactive policing and punitive disciplinary is not effective. It creates a barrier to access and it weakens the relationship. Our young people are our future library users. We have to focus on those relationships. Restorative justice practices can be easily implemented in programs in a million different ways. And I'm proud to say that Dr. Cook is already doing that. She doesn't even realize she's doing it. She's doing it in her Let's Talk Race with Randy series, creating that space where we can all learn and grow together. That's a tenet of restorative justice. Setting touchstones before a program starts, that's a tenet of restorative justice. We do it every day. We just need to put it at the forefront of everything that we do. I'm also looking at trauma-informed services as a way to combat inequities. And I love these two things together because while restorative justice tells us how we go about responding to these disciplinary infractions, the tenets of trauma-informed services lay the groundwork as to how we even look at our customers, how we have conversation with them, what those reference interviews look like. All of that, trauma-informed services lays the foundation. So when you work them together, it's beautiful. And in the library, trauma-informed services, we're already seeing it at Richland, social work collaborations, a lot of training for staff so they can empathetically serve diverse groups, and just being there for each other and really being in community. Not being performative in our action when we say we care about somebody, but really putting it at the forefront of everything that we do. Y'all, my pilot study, so excited about it. So with this pilot study, I looked at a library to assess their current uses of transformative library services. This library is in the very, I wouldn't even say very beginning because it's been a few years, but they're really trying to get there to actually implement restorative justice. I tried to look at every level. So I looked at the highest level in youth services, which is a youth coordinator or director. Then I looked at a senior librarian, and then I brought it to the front line and interviewed a library service staff member. It showed me a lot of things, but the main thing is that there's a gap from the top to the bottom. The way that information is being perceived on what's actually going to be implemented, it's not hitting the bottom the right way. So while the top might have the best intentions when it comes to developing a new service, how they're showing it to their staff is not getting across the right way. So, and one of the main things I saw was that my frontline staff member didn't even know what the current disciplinary policy was, which shows a huge gap in meaning that the frontline staff members might be moving off self. So if they're moving with implicit bias and they're responding to infractions or customers with their own biases, we're doing the library a disconnect. Okay, so that study's still going on, but these are some preliminary implications that I can make from it. The first, and I think it's something we all should do, is an internal self-check or check ourselves to make sure that we aren't moving in bias in our equity work and not being performative in it. Involving the community. A major part of restorative justice is the community involvement. So bringing them in and allowing them to be a part of the development process is key to the success of it. And then for anything to change, the system has to change. We can push equity-focused programs all day long, but if our systems are still broken, we're still doing them a disservice. So I'm gonna end this with just a call to action to you all. In my community, so the Black community, we have a saying that you have to be about the things that you say you're about. So when it comes to equity work, if we leave this space together and we're learning about all these amazing things that people are doing, if we're not actually doing the work, we're being performative and we're not being about the things that we truly say we are about. So I challenge you, in whatever your research looks like, whatever your work looks like, that you actually check yourself and make sure that you're putting that quality work out there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sierra. Next, we have Dr. Andrea Hickerson. She's the director of the School of Journalism and Mass Communication here at University of South Carolina. Her research interests include media literacy, deepfakes, and misinformation. And she's going to talk about news production by and of immigrants and refugees. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I'm very honored and humbled to be in your presence today and hear the different perspectives that people bring here. And so I'm going to start and end my remarks today with two humbling and transformative experiences. And so the first is when I was an undergraduate, I decided to study abroad in Strasbourg, France. And so that was on the border with Germany. And as part of that study abroad experience, we had to have an internship. And so I've always liked international affairs, international things, so I decided to volunteer at a refugee welcome center. And my work there was mostly working with middle school aged girls and helping them with their English homework. And at that time, they were from Eastern Europe. And then there was another person there that I wasn't really sure where they were from, but we got to be friends. We both liked to read the same books. And so I finally got up the courage to ask him how he ended up in France. And he said, "I'm a Kurd." And I didn't know what that meant. And I was so embarrassed. And here I am about ready to graduate, and I realized it's just one of those moments where I knew nothing, right? And so it was transformative in so many ways about what I didn't know about the world, about how I didn't know about migration and where people ended up. And what that did is it set me on this research path that I continue to follow, looking at international issues, but migrants and migration. So I use the title transnational populations because it covers a lot of different status, whether it's refugee, which has very political connotations, immigrant, asylum seeker. There's many different words used to capture these populations, and I've done several of those. But that was the moment where I thought, oh my gosh, I'm wrong here, I've got to know more. And so today I'm going to talk kind of about two different things, the stories that we tell about refugees and immigrants in the mass media, and then I'm going to talk for a moment about the stories that they tell about themselves. And so I'll start with the first, is that there's a lot of really interesting mass media studies on portrayals of refugees, migrants, asylum seekers, many of these populations, and a lot of them have really negative connotations. I mean, even the metaphors that they use to describe the migration of people, like it's a flood, right? That people are coming in and you can't stop that it's somehow out of control. There are depictions of people needing things, right? Always, what can we do to help them? So it's this kind of paternalistic, how can we help these people? This idea that they're unskilled. And it also, historically or in recent memory, they're tied to also issues like Islamophobia and concerns about terrorism, or even concerns about economic competition and what that means for local communities. And so one of the studies that I did with a colleague of mine was looking at media coverage around World Refugee Day. So World Refugee Day is a United Nations holiday to celebrate refugees. And so I come from the media studies journalism background, and holidays are a good way for news organizations to kind of structure content and to pick up something in the community. It's a good PR strategy as well to get attention around things. And so my colleague and I did a content analysis of World Refugee Day to see how people were talking about it. And what we found in there, what we were wondering is, was this an opportunity for the average population to learn about what was going on in international context? So we could find out why people were displaced from East Africa, or why they were coming from Macedonia at a certain time. And it turns out the articles were all about us as Americans and how we helped people, and the narratives kind of folded into that traditional Horatio Alger is, now you're here and look what you can become with our help. Okay? So it didn't really take any opportunity to educate people about why people had to move in the migration. So again, that's story one about what we tell others about immigrants. And I'll give you one more too. So I did another study with my same colleague, and we looked at letters to the editor about refugees, and we looked in the United States and Canada and Australia. So these are three countries that have traditionally accepted a lot of refugees, and we thought letters to the editor, again, thinking about journalism structure, it's supposed to be a range of voices, and would we see a range of voices in there? And then and so the days that we looked at were all related to the independence days, if you will, of Australia, Canada, and the United States. And so again, what we found is that we were not really telling stories about refugees, we were telling stories about ourselves. And the stories about refugees were folded into the national iconography of liberty and freedom and the nation as protector, and look at this other opportunity to show that we are living up to the values in which we were created and which we hold dear. And there were some differences. In Australia, there was a lot more talk about policy. In the US, there's a lot more talk about morality and religion, and that we owed it to refugees to have them here because that's where we're from. And so I'll leave you with that. Now I want to transition to the stories that immigrants and refugees tell about themselves. So one of my favorite studies that I did right after I finished my PhD was looking at what has historically been called the immigrant press. So the sociologist Robert Park wrote a book about the immigrant press in the US, and it was mostly foreign language, and he posited that this was just a transition to get people assimilated into the United States, and then they would read traditional mainstream media at the time. So I thought, okay, great, digital age. Let's go back and redo this and figure out how immigrants are going to the digital age. Joke on me, they weren't at that point in time. This is a while ago. But they were still using paper, neighborhood-based communication to educate each other about things. And so this study was interview-based, where I went and did interviews in New York, and North Carolina, and Seattle with the foreign language press, kind of asking them, and even asking them, what do you think immigrant press is? What do you think ethnic press is? What is the point of this? And a lot of it was kind of onboarding. So there's a very old Japanese-American newspaper in Seattle, and the editor we spoke with said her most circulated article was how to get a divorce. right? So things like that, like practical things when you move to a country you don't know how to get things done. Going to the PTA, what are the hours for something, how to vote, right? So there still is this kind of need that these immigrant communities said that they had. Another really interesting thing about that was the format of these, and I mentioned before they were print. So even though transnational populations are typically early adopters of digital technology because that enables them to maintain ties and frequency of communication with people in different communities and diaspora, they still valued kind of the tactile paper, and part of that was economic because they didn't have the competition from things like Craigslist or a lot of the ads that went online in mainstream news. They were still, in Chinese in local papers on the West Coast and still had that function, or still were in local businesses there. Another kind of interesting thing that I would love to follow up on is in North Carolina in particular, a lot of the Spanish language press were owned by law firms. And so what it was a marketing tool because they knew that they would have these articles and a population there. So all these different things there. So again, very practical news. That's what they were talking. They were talking to themselves because they had to teach what to do when you get to a certain place. And so lastly, I'll end with just a study that I'm working on now, and it's looking at Twitter and how refugees, I'm going to put it in quotes here, identify themselves on Twitter. So in this study, what I did is I looked up verified accounts of people that use the word refugee in their bio. And I got all kinds of people who are not refugees in this too. So people that are refugees from the West Coast or refugees from newspaper and now working in PR, right? So it's interesting to see that word. We were talking before how words change, right? There is a great example of that. But who is it and what do they mean when they're forwarding this identity of refugee in their social media use? And it was really interesting there because I saw a lot of people talking about, reframing issues and kind of pushing back and saying, well, look at this innovation that this refugee camp is doing. And so again, they were telling their own stories, but there really was not a lot there. It was journalists that were doing more of that. And they were, they were using it a little bit different from face-to-face communication, but because it was kind of going out to vacuum, I didn't get into the interaction about how people were responding to what they were saying. So I think I want to just conclude here by talking about another humbling experience that I had, because we always need those to keep us fresh, right? So I was giving a presentation about the Immigrant Project, where I'd gone and interviewed immigrant refugees to a group of students as guest speakers several years ago. And I was giving it, and the student in the classroom, very smart, she said to me, how can you do that if you're not from that culture? And man, I didn't know what to say, right? Put you on the spot, right? I mean, I was just interested. Is that good enough, right? And so I resumed my work, but very self-consciously after that point in time. And then for a different project, I was talking to somebody who runs a refugee organization and coordinates a lot of social services and also news organizations to things. And what do I know? What can you tell me about this? And she said to me, she's like, look, when you start to write about us in academic circles, you legitimize what we're saying and our experiences there. And so we need more people to do it. And so what she gave me was a different call to action than what I was expecting. And so with that, I want to thank the organizers of this and this community that we have as our call to action for the role that we can play as educators and as scholars as bringing these topics to the forefront. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. That was wonderful. And our final guest today on our panel is Dr. Jenna Spiering. She's an assistant professor in the iSchool here at the University of South Carolina. She will talk about her work related to LGBTQIA+ young adult literature and collection development as it relates to the ongoing book challenges in South Carolina and across the country.
I'm going to use slides because I talk about books and it's better to see them. Okay. Thank you for having me today. Good morning, everyone. I was asked to be on this panel to talk about my work that analyzes LGBTQ young adult literature. I look at young adult literature and particularly graphic novels and how that kind of relates to book challenges across the nation and specifically here in South Carolina that are targeting books that I've done some thinking about. And I spend a lot of time talking to my students about and asking them to read and asking them to put on the shelves in their libraries. And I tell them about how important these books are for students and why we need to have them. But I think that it's really important to also take a close look at books, to read books and think about what's in the books. Sometimes in the context of these book challenges, we focus on the messaging, and it's like, don't talk about the book, don't talk about that page in the book, talk about, our bigger call as librarians to not censor and to fight book bans and challenges. I agree with that, but I like to look at the book, what's in the book, and if we have like a little bit better idea about what's happening in these books, maybe we'll be better at defending these books. And I wanted to share a story. I was at the local school library conference, our South Carolina School Library Conference last week, and I sat down for lunch with a few school librarians, and we started talking about what a hard year it's been for school librarians. They say it's harder than last year being online. It's just, they feel constantly under fire. This particular librarian said his principal came in and was like, do you have these books? Remove them. And I know that's happening in a lot of places. They're just quietly being removed. We're reading about the big stories, but they're being quietly removed from a lot of libraries. And he said, we started talking about two books in particular, Genderqueer and also All Boys Aren't Blue, that are really the target of a lot of these attacks. And he said, but you know what? They are shocking. And we had a good conversation about how maybe it is shocking to you, but that's an opportunity to sort of step back and ask yourself why somebody else's experience might be shocking to you and what kind of knowledge we're lacking about that community in order to feel that it's shocking. And I don't share this story to villainize that particular school librarian, but I do think we have work to do within and with the work that we do in the school with teaching school librarians and preparing them. And that's why I like to spend time reading the books and talking about the books. Because this particular book, All Boys Aren't Blue, is a memoir, a memoir manifesto, as George Johnson calls it. It's his experience growing up as a Black queer youth. It's about his sexual experiences growing up and everything that he faces. I'll play this quick TikTok that it's only a minute where he explains.
So 11 years ago today, I tested HIV positive. It's very interesting to be going through a nationwide book ban and having All Boys Aren't Blue be considered pornography, when realistically I'm just telling my story about being a Black queer youth who didn't have proper sex education and wasn't even aware that we were really still in an HIV epidemic that solely could affect people like myself. I continue to fight for this book because I want youth to have the materials in their hands that I never got to have. And it's not to say that my book wouldn't, if I had my book, it would have prevented me from in the future being diagnosed with HIV, but it is to say that I had the right to have this type of material and the right to know this type of material. Being someone who is an HIV advocate and activist in community, I want the youth to have my story and stories like mine so that they know that someone exists out there like them, but also so that they have resources and tools so they don't have to go through the same risk factors that I went through myself. So I'm proudly positive and appreciative of today, and just thankful for everyone who continues to support All Boys Aren't Blue, and excited for the future. Happy reading.
I really recommend this book if you haven't read it. But what's interesting about All Boys Aren't Blue and Genderqueer also, which is challenged a lot, is that they are memoirs. They are young people's experiences. So what does it say? They're not fiction. It's not somebody trying to create something scandalous for a young audience to corrupt them. It's actual youth's experiences. It's not a surprise to anyone that there's a lack of LGBTQ representation in curriculum in schools. There are currently laws in the books in 4 states that keep educators from even mentioning that. And of course, we have bills all over the country being introduced to add to those kinds of laws, like the Don't Say Gay bill recently passed in Florida. And LGBTQ research in school libraries is happening, but it largely focuses on collections. So we have, and that's important work too. My colleagues are looking at the underrepresentation of LGBTQ materials in collections even before all of this started. We know that librarians are self-censoring books often based on their fear of their community's reaction, parents, administrators, and even their own personal objections. And we know that that kind of self-censorship takes a lot of forms. Book labeling, putting books on special shelves, restricting them, making students have permission slips in order to check them out. We know that school librarians who might purchase other controversial materials, like that have violence or profanity, are still reluctant to collect these materials. And some of my work has even looked at how language in book reviews sort of contributes to some of that censorship. But furthermore, we know that young adult literature is also a sexual health information source for a lot of teens. So they're not always, it might not surprise you to know that they're not always comfortable asking their librarian or going to a database to look for sexual health information. So popular media, the internet, and even literature can be important sources for that information. And places where teens can, look at things like desire, vocabulary for intimacy, as one writer puts it, queer representations of sex, sexual health, intimacy, conversations about consent and sexual assault, and other things that are important in the cultural moment we're in to talk about within literature. My work focused on texts themselves. So, I have colleagues that do research with literature and like the English department, American Studies, and they maybe look at the text more kind of in isolation. But I really think about the way that texts might be used, how young people would take them up. What kind of questions would they ask when they're reading them? What kind of conversations could we have? What can they do? And so some of the books I've looked at are on the screen. I'm not going to be talking about these ones today, but I've written about how we can use LGBTQ graphic novels to sort of disentangle gender and sexuality. They often get conflated, and that's part of the problem too, that we think that talking about somebody's gender means that we're going to be talking about sex. I've talked about how books can be models for consent, enthusiastic consent, non-consent, and also how young adult literature will focus, can focus on sexual health information, which is, I'll just briefly talk about a study that I'm working on that I presented recently with a colleague. And we looked at about 30 different titles, and we decided to focus on these three. We do critical content analysis, so we isolated passages in all of these books where they talked about physical intimacy, relationships, sex, and those kinds of dynamics. And then we sort of tried to make sense of the messages that teens were getting from these books in those passages. And these are three really interesting examples. All books contain passages where you can see consent being negotiated in different ways. Like I said, enthusiastically or not giving consent. And we also can see representations of sexual health information in these books that expands narratives. So for example, in that middle book, Like a Love Story, takes place in the 80s at the height of the AIDS epidemic. A lot of books published in the 80s for young adults would have talked about teen pregnancy and contraception and how dangerous that could be. This book, and this wasn't published in the 80s, obviously, that's the time period that the book is set in. But this book talks about what it was like to be a member of the gay community during this time. So it talks about sexual health and intimacy, but in a different way. And all three books also have representations of queer relationships and queer intimacy to sort of expand our notions of what that looks like if you're not a straight teen. And I'm not going to pull out the passage from Gender Queer that receives a lot of attention, because that's kind of that's a tactic used by book censors too, to pull it out of context and shock you, as my colleague in school library said earlier. But this is an example of what sexual intimacy would look like for a teen like the author, who's non-binary, but when we pull it out of context, out of the trajectory of the author's story, their sort of coming of age in this book, it makes people mad. They find it shocking, and that's particularly because it's a graphic novel, which is, graphic novels are targeted at a rate that other novels aren't also. So these are some themes. And of course, it has important implications. In the absence of comprehensive sex education, young adult literature can be a really important source of sexual health information. Exemplar texts serve as models of consent. Young adult teachers, educators, librarians, and adults also can provide and should provide novels that have various descriptions of sex for students in order to get that sort of informal but also important sources of information from what they're reading. And I wanted to just share, this is from an op-ed that Maya Kobabe, the author of Gender Queer, wrote, I think, for the Washington Post. And Kobabe illustrates this op-ed. If you haven't looked at it, it's really good. Please leave the queer books on the library shelves where queer teens can find them. As a queer teen, I desperately needed them, and queer teens of today need them too. I'll just say that I think that this kind of work adds to the whole conversation about these book challenges. We have to look at collections and what's not there. We have to fight book bans, but we also have to read the book and know what we don't know that we can learn from books. consider the way that texts might be used and who might want them. This is just a plug for our book that's coming out with my colleague, Dr. Kitsy and Dr. Green too. Because, this book is actually not about books at all. If you're not going to be looking at books, like what else can you do? What about your policies, programming, and practices can make your library more inclusive too if somebody else has made it so that books can't be on the shelf? And I'll continue to think about how we can work with school libraries, school librarians in our education courses to make sure that they're serving these students as well. So thank you for having me today.
Thank you so much, Jenna. What powerful presentations, huh? Those were fantastic. Thank you so much for giving I love how the panel represents so many facets of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so we're going to open up now for questions from the audience for the panel, for panel members. And I'll give you a second to catch your breath, but any questions from the audience?
We don't bite.
Yes.
What studies have been conducted that relate to how kids relate to these books? What do they take from, and how is that determined?
Not many. It's hard to get that kind of data about how students interact with books, but there have been some especially within education research, and usually not in public school settings. The studies that I know of have happened in kind of affirming charter schools and other private schools where this work can be done. But basically that's a site for really, important conversations about gender and sexuality and identity. And there are some examples of that, but we need more of that. I'd love to talk more with students, especially, we don't have their perspectives about what's going on with these challenges, maybe formally in the research too. So I think that is a direction that we should be going in.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, yes, thank you. Yeah, if you wouldn't mind speaking to the mics, thank you. So I have a quick question for Ciara. So Ciara, this week, actually, I'm teaching a library and information organizations course, and we're, leadership in information organizations course. And this week we were talking about human resources, and so I was writing things about that. And I was looking at some notes that I had from the last time I taught a similar course, and some of the resources from just 3 years ago, I Am Harvard and different resources that were created in 2017, 2018. The websites are no longer maintained. It seems that there was really hot, everyone was doing a lot of things about including youth and including diversity, but then it seems to have kind of chilled, like those websites are no longer active. Could you talk a little bit about that? Have you noticed what creates these waves of interest in these topics?
I think the sweet spot about youth programming and the hardest part about youth programming is knowing that you have to be consistent to build your audience. And I think we go through peaks where we push youth-focused programs, but then they're not as consistent as our other programs. Attendance isn't as consistent, and libraries or organizations kind of falling by the wayside because we do want numbers. We do want to feel like we're doing it, having an impact. But in library programs, and I'm proud to say, even though you might not see those pushes on the websites because they're not as consistent, there are people in the beginning stages, like how I was, young and early career professionals that know the power that the youth voice has, and we're pushing for them. So I think sometimes it's a disservice on the system itself because they don't prioritize youth voices, and they kind of forget that our youth will be our lifelong users of wherever organization we're in. So if we don't establish that relationship, if we don't amplify their voices, they'll fall by the wayside. So I think you just highlighted another disservice that we kind of forget about our young people too.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So what I understand from what you presented is that you are not just a program, it's how to get the whole system on board. So this is just a pattern that you always do, and so it won't discontinue after it's not a hot topic. Is that correct?
I spent the bulk of my career focusing solely on programs, and to the point where I love programs. I miss it every day as a doc student. I still go to youth programs with my partners in Charlotte, and then I still do stuff with Richland. But now I'm more focused on how can we create an equitable space before the youth come into the space, because I think there's no way you can create equity in a library if you don't have equitable practices. So we can push a million library programs that are geared towards the LGBT community, geared towards serving marginalized groups. But if the system itself is inequitable, then we're already doing a disservice. A library will never be as relevant as it wants to be and as valuable as it should be in the community if our policies aren't equitable. So that's where I'm starting at.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
This is kind of a related question, and it's a bigger, well, you're part of the solution to this problem, I realize, but because librarianship is still so white, I think that also contributes to some of the reasons why it's not attended to these, communities that are from diverse backgrounds. So what brilliant ideas might you have about how we can diversify the profession?
So I'm so excited you said that, because I had a meeting with my advisor, and she drops like a lot of gems on me. And one of the most recent things she said, because I was talking about how we have to do self-checks as professionals and practitioners, and sometimes even as a member of the Black community, I still have to check myself. But then when you're doing a self-check on yourself, that also requires you to check your colleagues too. So being able and being an advocate, especially in youth services, and everything that you do, you're an advocate for youth. So if you see your colleague, you would never, but if you see someone doing a disservice, it's your responsibility to call that out. So Dr. Cook dropped on me that we should create a toolkit that serves as a guide to a self-check, so that we have something tangible that we're able to give to a practitioner who might not be as seasoned, or sometimes the seasoned ones be the problem. Someone who is seasoned, so they have a list of things that they can do to actually check themselves. Because it's one thing to look online and you feel like, oh, I did something because I researched something online. But if you have it like a checklist, like I need to do this, this, and this, that can really shift one's perspective.
I want to add to that. Your question is quite unique, and I think for me, here's just a simple experience, even being at this campus, and this room had to walk through the library. And immediately I looked at a certain area to see if this person is still there. Before I became a librarian, I did something that was probably very unusual at the time, which was to march into Thomas Cooper right before I was accepted into graduate school and to receive SLIS. And I demanded. I walked up to the counter, and they would just found me amusing, and I said, before I even give you my money, I want to know what will this library give me. And I remember the person at the desk said, well, this is interesting. Why would you ask that? And I said, well, when you come out of high school and you get your bachelor's, when you're going through that, I had no understanding of how to use an academic library properly. That was just off the record. I had you should just know early on, I never thought I'd be a librarian because I was terrified of the school librarian. You're talking about the 60s and 70s, and I would say corporal punishment was in effect, was the best way. And this started was amusing. I remember they went and they got one of the head persons to come out, and then she asked me a few questions, and we actually toured this entire library, collections, everything, looked at databases at the time. And then she sat me down, and she says, "Can you come to my office?" And she talked. And I remember I had my resume with me. I don't know why, I must be coming from grad school with it. And she said, "Can I just see that? Because if you have it." And she looked at it and she said, "This is remarkable. Wow, you're an educator, you came back to give your mother dementia, and you're now re-enrolling, you're not like starting over." And the reason why your question stands out to me from a different angle is because this is what she said to me, and I have never, ever forgotten that. Given what I've seen with what you have, have a master's in public administration and you're doing this, I want you just to never forget me. Because what will happen, my opinion, and what the studies show, and you will see this, is that once you graduate, within 5 years you'll probably be a director as a man. She was wrong. I did it in 3. And she said, I will continue to progress. And she says, now you know, just like education, the men rise to the top. They're the superintendents. They're the principals. Never forget that this is a female-dominated profession. And yes, there are women who do not bring women up along them. You've probably met them. I said, oh yes, I've met some women who say one minute they are like, I'm closing the door on other women. That is an aspect that I've never forgotten about this profession. So when we want to talk about race and ethnicity, gender is right there with it that we need to think about. And I do not ever let that be forgotten as a male where I'm at in this profession in the Library of Congress. My boss is, if you know Dr. Carl Hickman, and Robert there for my lesson.
Yeah.
So I'm struck by your work and their work and kind of the intersectionality of it, right? So the task that you mentioned at the beginning is that, there's older people using library resources. So when you are being an administrator and preparing things for the disabled population, do you take into account the types of topics that they're talking about? How do you prioritize your work?
Goodness. From my perspective and my topic, there is a major intersectionality that has to be thought about. Your area, when you were talking about communications, to me is, if we do it right, it's the output of what we should be conveying to our different groups. And the work that we do, because I have a lot of things I never dreamed I'd be doing, from the IT side all the way to the IS side. And you're talking about an interesting match, because that to me is the true duality of librarianship, when you are the architect of the technology and then you move over to the information side to say, here's how that technology works. I get to play with that, and that is something I think librarians dream about. It's almost you saying, I'm going to build a new version of WorldCat and tell you how to do it. That is what I get to kind of play with, platforms and classes. You have to always be mindful of who the population is, and you have to have them massively, not tacitly, massively included so that you can examine the flaws. People tell you really quickly what is wrong, and if they're open to it, they'll start to tell you what's right, and then you go forward from there. So inclusion in a very different way is always going to be something that we try to think about, given technology changes, how do you navigate that with a population that might not want to keep up? Because we're going to get there at a certain point. Believe it or not, at a certain point, I would say with this, I'm quite sure, if statistics are right, there are at least 5 people in this room that are carrying a flip phone and do not want us to know. Because it's comfortable. It's really comforting to know I just want this phone to talk, I don't need this other stuff, I get to do what I need to do. That is nice, but I'm going to need to kind of gently pull you with us down the road as I start to talk about, well, we're going virtual, we're going into the cloud. What does that mean for access and your use of this service? That can be uncomfortable. And that again goes back to digital literacy. And we're all going to find ourselves there if we live long enough. We just will. We're going to have to figure out, for me at my age, I'm definitely like, I need to make sure I'm always going to be open-minded to, okay, we're doing this grant trial. All right, I'm going to do what you say then. If you say it gets us over here. That's what you're going to have to try to navigate, because if it happens to you later in life where something creates a disability, you can also be at a very, very detrimental disadvantage because you're navigating a bunch of stuff. For example, we have veterans, and they aren't, of course, as you know, born always sick or vision impaired. You go to war, you have some type of injury, and you have to navigate, oh, I'm sorry to tell you, you just lost your sight. Thank you for your service to the country. I'm your therapist, and I now have to orient you into this new life. Because the life you had, we aren't going to not discuss, but we need to prepare you for this new life. You've got to deal with that in a time span of forever. So you have to figure out how to help that person with this, and then orient them into this new life of here's what is available, and life is still wonderful. You just have to examine it in a different way.
Thank you. Other questions?
I'd like to make what I think is an interesting historic comment based on what Sierra said about taking the library out into the community. Well, the iSchool is located in Davis College. And in the 1920s, Havel Babcock was an English professor in the college, and his office was there. Havel Babcock said, if you can't come to the University of South Carolina, the University of South Carolina will come to you. And that was the beginning of our distance education program and our virtual learning programs. So the the history of the notion of reaching out to the people is a part of this specialty.
Thank you very much, thank you, yes. Other questions? Yes.
I was interested, Andrea, in your research and the reason you came to it. Are there a lot of other media researchers examining immigration issues that you collaborate with? And also in terms of what's going on right now with immigration, any real-time research?
Right. I think one of the challenges for doing research on immigration is that the different terms that people use to describe it and the different political classes that they've done. So it's hard to compare study to study because they're looking at border politics, right, which are very different, for example, than the refugee crisis in Poland right now. So it's hard to kind of track that stuff. But there are really interesting media products coming out of refugee camps where they've organized and put out their own Twitter feeds and those types of things. So that is one way that's doing it. But it's a really hard field, but so important, and so we shouldn't just forget it, right? Because there's linguistic issues in there, there's cultural issues in there too, and then there's political concerns. I mean, these are all political crises, is what I talked about essentially, right? Why people have to move and uproot is our political crises. And I was reflecting last night on what we could say about Ukraine right now. It's just my opinion of what I've read and stuff is we're in the middle of a war, so it's this idea of like we're helping out. But what happens as time goes on? How does the way we talk about what's going on start to shift? And you've heard maybe too a lot of people comparing how we're already talking about the refugees in Poland versus the refugees that were coming from Syria into there too. And what does that mean about colonialism or the color of skin or racism embedded in that? And so it'll be really interesting to shift because the recent stuff has focused on refugees from the Middle East. Or in the context of the U.S., when people think immigration, they think the border with Mexico. So there's all these different kind of frames and hard to compare there. Interesting stuff.
Thank you. Thanks. We have time for maybe one more question. Yes.
I have one for Jason. My name is Lee Kawoya. I'm an associate professor in the school. So been interested in the legal issues around access for blind and visually impaired. And the National Library of California State does a fantastic job through the network of other state libraries, talking book initiatives. But you serve a specific constituency by law. But in your comment, you made a very important point that we are all potential beneficiaries. It takes my event to become blind. Most of us who wear glasses,
I'm not saying you automatically qualify, but yes, all of us who wear glasses are sort of, kind of already letting you know
on the way,
kind of
right?
coming to the surface.
So the question is, how do we expand the conversation, make everyone understand the importance of supporting these resources, the work you do, the services? Because part of the problem, the barrier, are the legal issues. Who can be served, who cannot be served? You know, there's copyright in there and all these issues which you and I can talk about privately, but how do we get folks to be concerned about this issue? Because eventually one of us is going to be the beneficiary.
Your question actually, I think, goes to all of us in a unique sense, with communication to me being the output of how we would learn what we're saying and then how we would then change to meet the need of what we need to be saying. From the National Library perspective, one of our biggest things that I think we try to focus on, at least under my leadership and probably some predecessors, but I'm really going to try to grapple with this, is to show that it is for everyone as opposed to who we think it is for. In looking at what a library does, for me, from a humanistic standpoint, this goes back to like just my parents growing up in the South, which always would come back to certain things saying, don't say that about people, don't do this. If you remember how your parents, some parents did this, if you had that experience, it was always in the back of your mind, because that could happen to you. Now, that's one layer to think about it. From a deeply wonderful humanistic experience, that we go through the various layers, understanding who we are as humans, then you get to, well, why wouldn't we want to do that for everybody? This should just be a common service. This should be something universal, that we should be understanding that no matter what's going on, this should be here for people. Even if this were never to happen to me, I think people should have the same access. One of the things that I find very uniquely frustrating is NLS should exist, but boy, we shouldn't have to be fighting just like the advocacy organizations like the National Federation for the Blind or American Council of the Blind, because you're saying to people, well, you know, we just didn't kind of think about you when we started. We just thought that this wouldn't happen, and it's, no, this happens. We know that as humans on this planet, we have things that occur. What does it look like to try to say, what type of life would it look like for everybody to have access equitably across it? What type of society would that begin to look like? So that conversation goes into a variety of things when we talk about biases, as a lot of people have said. What does it look like when you view somebody who is different from you? What are you thinking? Like, oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, now you're thinking ableism. Oh, I need to help you. Oh, okay, that's not what they asked. The thing is an inner conversation I think we'll have to all have ourselves to kind of say, what type of services do we want? Because I've met some wonderful people who have told me immediately, and we all know, we were talking earlier about just language and how it changes. If I go back to school and get a doctorate, I really will go into linguistics. I'm really, really interested in dialect and tone and colloquialism, because when you hear the you people, and in the South, when you say y'all a certain way, you know, it's immediately like, oh, you were viewing me as a different. Why did you say it that way? Then it goes into the heart of separation. And that is something that I think we would have to view to say, why is that the case? Why wouldn't this be equitable for anybody? Why are you not going to do this for all people? That's a deeper conversation that we have to have as humans. Not even society, it's just human beings. And if we can get to that, we will have a wonderful planet to be on.
Thank you very much. And I agree with what you're saying. I often in classes will talk about students about, sometimes we'll write about an inclusion project, and it's they need this, they need that. And how can we word that in a different way? And it's amazing how when we word it in this population, we can do this, the approach is completely different than when it's they. And so thank you very much. And I think that applies to all of the populations that we've been talking about as well. So thank you all so much for your questions. Thank you, panel, very, very much for your presentation.